Hello, and welcome to lesson number 2 in the series of lectures on the Bronze Age. In lesson number 1, we asked the question, what were the developments that led to the appearance of cities and writing in the Middle East in the early Bronze Age? In this lesson, we'll start answering the question and get into the details. So it all begins apparently with irrigation. The invention of a large-scale irrigation in the great regions of the great rivers in the Middle East made possible the cultivation of larger areas than before, as did the use of plows. As a result, communities now create surpluses, too much food that they do not consume on the spot. Therefore, what do we do with this food? We store it. Storage of food means that we have now a new concept, wealth. Certain communities are wealthier now than less fortunate communities. And obviously, that triggers the envy and perhaps hostile activities against the wealthier communities. What they now need to do is to protect their wealth, to protect themselves. How do they do that? Well, they organize in order to build fortifications. Building fortifications isn't a simple thing. There are talented people who study this field and they become experts on it. You need to be a skilled builder in order to build a wall that will protect your village from its potential enemies. So certain people have to become specialists. Specialization is, of course, important, but the question is, who can afford it? If a builder dedicates his skills to building walls and then temples and other monumental buildings and so on, who gives him his salary? Who pays him for that? He is not a farmer any longer, so someone has to pay him. And that means that we need to have an organized community with someone at the top that gives orders, that collects taxes from the people. Okay, so we have here an economical management. And in collecting these taxes, now we have a certain budget that can afford paying the builders and their assistants and so on. So not only do we need specialization, we need taxation, and we need someone who gives orders. A king or a governor. We now have hierarchy. So now that we have hierarchy and taxation, we have people going around and collecting these taxes. When we speak about small communities, tens of people, maybe 150 people and so on, it's a relatively small number. You can remember who didn't pay his taxes and how much he or she paid. Once we're talking about larger communities, hundreds of people, perhaps even thousands later, it becomes a problem. We need to develop a method for recording all these important economical details. And therefore, the need for a system of writing, a script, has to be used for that purpose. So the first records, in general, in the world, are economical records, and this is probably why they emerged in the first place. It's quite surprising because sometimes people expect that the invention of writing would be the result of higher and more sophisticated issues such as perhaps religion, perhaps writing poems, literature, and so on. But as it happens, it looks like it's probably the result of the economical needs of the emerging cities in the Middle East. And therefore, we now have cities. But wait a second. We understand perhaps why cities emerged, but what is a city? What is the difference between a city and a village? Well, this is a really tricky question. We can't really answer that simply, but let me try to give some characteristics of a typical city. There are a number of accepted criteria for that, so let's see what they are. Firstly, we need to have a population size, which is a major component. Obviously, tens of people are not a city. Thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps we'd be willing to call that a city. But where's the border? No one can tell. It's an interesting question, and it's debatable. Compare that to modern cities that have a population of 30 million people. Is there something in common, population-wise, between a Mesopotamian city with 50,000 people, 20,000 people, and a modern 30 million people? Well, to some extent, yes, but in many respects, it's a totally different phenomenon. Yet we call both of them cities. Now, in a city, we need to have a central government, as we mentioned earlier, a king, a local governor, some sort of government, and an administrative power. That is, we need to have a kind of a local police, an army perhaps, to protect from the threats from the outside, and so on. A city will also have a wall with gates. It will probably have urban planning. So we expect to find a plan of streets, designated areas allocated for public buildings such as temples, palaces, gate plazas, local ordinary dwellings, and so on and so forth. So these will probably be a common criteria for identifying a city in antiquity. In the past, by the way, some scholars suggested that the first city in the world is Jericho in the Neolithic era. That's prehistory. It seems to have a large tower and something that looks like a wall, thousands of years before the early Bronze Age. But Jericho is an exception, and there are other interpretations to the wall and tower in Jericho, and perhaps the best thing would be not to include Jericho as a city until we have further information to corroborate that theory. Now, what about the early Bronze Age in the land of Israel? In the land of Israel, too, this is the earliest period of urbanization. Cities in different sizes, dozens of dunams to even more than 100 dunams, appear. Among the earliest urban locals, we should mention Megiddo, Chatzor, Beit She'an, Dan in the north, Bet Yerach near the Kinneret, but interestingly enough, not Jerusalem. It's quite amazing to realize that Jerusalem, the most important city in the history of this country, period, was not even born when cities like Megiddo, Chatzor, and Beit She'an were already populated in the early Bronze Age. This is not to say that we have nothing in Jerusalem at the early Bronze Age. We do have dwellings, houses of the Arad type, we'll mention later. But that's it. No walls, no city. Perhaps it's a little village at the time. Jerusalem will only be born as a city during the Middle Bronze Age, and then it will become eventually the most important city in the country. We will see an example of a temple from the early Bronze Age at Megiddo. This is Tel Megiddo. Megiddo was announced a UNESCO World Heritage Site together with the other two biblical mounds, Chatzor and Be'er Sheva. Megiddo is located at the mouth of Wadi Ara, or Nachal Iron in Hebrew, or the Path of Aruna in Egyptian texts. It is located at the entrance to the Valley of Jezreel. Megiddo is one of the most important cities in the region in antiquity. and it is perhaps the most important city, archaeologically speaking, for the analysis of pottery and dating of the entire northern region of Israel in the biblical period. Megiddo is also one of the most important Christian sites in this country, as in the book of Revelation in the New Testament it is said that the battle between good and evil at the end of days will take place right here at Armageddon. Armageddon means in Hebrew Har Megiddo. Megiddo as a settlement exists already in the Neolithic and later Chalcolithic era, but as an urban center it comes up as early as the early Bronze Age, and later it continues to be an urban center during the Middle Bronze and Late Bronze periods. In the Middle Bronze Age, Megiddo is also mentioned as Makti, according to some scholars, in the execration texts from Egypt. In the 15th century BCE, Megiddo plays a major role in a story that takes place right here. This is the campaign of Thutmose III, the Egyptian pharaoh, against an alliance of Canaanite cities. And they are defeated eventually right here by Thutmose, who also attacks the city. Now I'm standing at the city's gate from that period, so perhaps this is the gate Thutmose actually saw with his own eyes. Later, in the biblical period, it is related in the Bible that King Solomon builds Megiddo, Chatzor, and Gezer. Later, in the 9th century, Megiddo is one of the most important cities in the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, in the time of King Achav. In the 8th century BCE, King Achaziah, who was defeated by a rebel called Yehu, dies of his wounds in Megiddo. At the end of the 7th century, King Yoshiao, the king of Judah, was mortally wounded near this tell when he tried to stop the troops of the Egyptian ruler Pharaoh Necho. During the Second Temple period, Megiddo, the tell, was abandoned, and eventually a village evolved down at the foot of the tell, and that is Kfar Otnai. A military legion camp was erected here in the Roman era, and therefore the name of the site changed into Legio. I'm standing now at the summit of Tel Megiddo, and right here we can see the most important part of the city for about 2,000 years. Since the early Bronze Age until Iron Age I, a series of temples was built here, one on top of the other, one next to the other. These temples include, perhaps one of the most impressive remains here, the round platform, which was probably used as an altar within the confines of the larger structure of an early Bronze Age temple. There's a flight of steps on the left-hand side corner of that structure. Assuming that this was the entrance for the priests who sacrificed on this altar, one may assume that they faced the site of worship, which was on the other direction. Indeed, if one looks at the other direction, one sees Mount Carmel. Interestingly enough, the Bible in the book of Kings relates that in the Carmel region, in later generations of course, people used to worship a god called Baal Carmel. Is it possible that the Canaanites here at the holy precinct of the Tell of Megiddo worshipped an earlier version of Baal Carmel, the Canaanite god? It is a possibility, but we'll probably never know for sure.
Okay, so now we have a fairly good idea about the early Bronze Age and its background, also in this country. Let us go into some of the details. What are the characteristics of the early Bronze Age from different perspectives in the land of Israel? This is an agrarian society. It is based on agriculture. Now, that's not really new, as we remember this is the heritage of the Neolithic era already. However, this is an agrarian society, and this is not to say that herding stops. So we still have herding. The adoption of the plow is associated with the early Bronze Age. Now, to cultivate the land in the mountainous regions, such as the Judean hills,
terraces are needed to level the ground, and the earliest terraces are apparently from this period. And you can see here a picture of some terraces taken in the region of Jerusalem. In some places, we find for the first time unplastered cisterns. We have them in Metzer, north of Gezer, Tel Dalit, south of Ta'anach. You should note that there's an important distinction between a cistern and a well. And in this picture, in this drawing, you can see the difference. A cistern is a reservoir for water dug into the bedrock. Sometimes its upper part is built of stones, but it is simply a reservoir for rainwater. A well is different. A well is a kind of a hole in the ground that goes deep enough so as to reach the water table, the aquifer. It has its own water source. So what we find are cisterns. Wells were already known in previous periods. Okay, we know quite a lot about the life of people. What about the death? What about burials in the early Bronze Age? Well, in the early Bronze Age, we find family burials in caves. So the entire family is buried in one spot, perhaps several generations. And inside these graves, we find vessels, cooking vessels and so on. We usually call these burial offerings, assuming that they were offered to the dead as part of a ritual involving bringing goods to the tomb. However, this is not entirely true. Perhaps what we see are vessels used by the family during the burial for certain purposes, eating, cooking, perhaps washing the body of the deceased, and perhaps there are other interpretations to that. Now, tombs from the early Bronze Age were found in Jericho, Ha'ai, Tel Anasbe, and elsewhere. Some of them are shaft tombs, meaning it's an underground structure approached by a shaft, a hole in the ground. In other tombs, we have cremation, that is, burning the body of the deceased and collecting the ashes and the little pieces of bones that remain. In other tombs, we have secondary burials. That is, once the body decomposes, the family members come back to the tomb and collect the bones and move them to a certain location inside the cave. A practice known already from the Chalcolithic period, the secondary burial, that is. In the field of architecture, one of the typical things we find in the early Bronze Age are megaron structures, mainly in temples, larger structures, where we have an elongated structure with antai, two walls at the front flanking the entrance. Such an example can be seen in the temples of Megiddo, for instance. And you can see the plan of the Megaron building right now. What about the pottery used in the period? Well, there are different types of pottery. We won't go into these details too much, but at least some basic notions. So we have the typical Beit Yerach vessels or Beit Yerach pottery, named after the site of Beit Yerach near the Kinneret. They were made by hand. They had small bases, so they were quite unstable. They were covered in red and black colors, and they were polished once the color dried. Vessels resembling these were found also in Syria. Another type of popular vessel is the Abydos vessel, or Abydos type of vessels. We find juglets and jars, usually covered in red color, red slipped, and then polished. They reached Egypt, so there was commerce between Egypt and the land of Israel in that period. And this is quite important, as in Egypt they can be dated, and therefore this makes them important for the dating of the early Bronze Age in the land of Israel. Weapons. Men always made weapons, unfortunately, so we also have weapons from the early Bronze Age. And the interesting type is called the epsilon axe, and these may also show a northern influence. So pottery here and weapons are quite important from an archaeological historical perspective, as they allow us to date at least part of the period dated better and more accurately, and because they testify to commerce with the north and the south, with Egypt and Syria at the period. So we've reached a point where we can actually stand now and visit a typical Bronze Age site. I chose Tel Arad for that purpose. You'll see in a moment why. And we have a video clip we prepared for you showing you the different sites of the Tel. But we'll do that in lesson number 3.